Hello and welcome to the first lecture of the next chapter, which is A New Nation, right? And so this chapter focuses on the first few presidencies, the first four presidencies to be exact, right? So through President Washington, President Adams, President Jefferson, and President Madison, right? And so this is when the country is still new. Um, it's only about, by the time Madison's out of office, really it's only about 25 or 30 years later, right, from the founding of the nation. So it's kind of those first few decades. All these presidents were involved with the writing of the Constitution in some way or another. Um, so it's an important period when they're developing, right? And as a new nation, as any nation does, but especially as a new nation, right, they face a lot of new challenges, right? Economic challenges, governing challenges, foreign policy challenges, right? And so the main focus of this chapter is to be able to answer this essential question here. How effectively did the new nation deal with the challenges it faced, right? Were they successful in them? Were they unsuccessful? Things to consider as you go through. Right, so the first president of the United States, hopefully you guys know this, is George Washington, right? He was inaugurated as president in 1789. So they have the Constitution at this point, right? But they don't have a government. The Constitution gives a relatively broad outline of what the government should do and how it should do it, right? And so now they needed to actually get to work to create a government that would be appropriate under the Constitution. And so that's what George Washington and his the first Congress and his advisors had to do. One of the first things that happens is the signing of the Judiciary Act of 1789, and this kind of sets up the Supreme Court so that the Constitution kind of says we need a Supreme Court, but doesn't say how many justices there should be and kind of what they're responsible for, right, or how the court system should work. And so this first act in 1789 creates a Chief Justice, someone in charge, right, and then 5 Associate Justices. So that's a total of 6, right? If you guys are familiar with it today, there's actually 9 justices today. So the number of Supreme Court justices has changed over time, which is interesting because there's a debate going on now that if the Democrats take control, if President Biden wins and the Senate gets control, should they pack the court, right? Should they change the law so they can put more judges on the Supreme Court to kind of be more on their side? Right? This is a very tricky situation, but it's not necessarily without precedent, right? There have been times when the Supreme Court number has increased. Um, so yeah. They also set up federal courts, right? A couple different federal courts to deal with different regions, right? So specific regions of the country have different federal courts that, if something happens, right, those are the courts that hear those cases. They also, in this law, it stipulates that state court decisions, so things say only happening in New York, relating to New York, could be appealed to the federal courts if something is involving the Constitution occurs, right? So there's a constitutional issue involved, right? So if someone believes that you were arrested improperly, right, and it violated your constitutional rights, and the state court rules that it didn't, you can then appeal to the federal court, federal level, to see if they would hear your case and rule otherwise, right? He also goes around setting and establishing precedent for the executive branch, right, the presidential branch. And so, obviously, you have President Washington. The person who came in second in the Electoral College that year was John Adams. So, his vice president was John Adams. And with his input and with Congress's approval, they create the first 3 executive cabinet levels, right? Cabinet positions. And those are the Department of State, so the Secretary of State, which still exists today, the Department of the Treasury, the Secretary of the Treasury, that title still exists, and the Department of the Army. Right now, there's the Joint Chiefs, which is of staff, which is all the military leaders kind of in one. But these are the first 3 executive departments to exist. The Department of State deals with foreign affairs, for the most part, and kind of the political nature in the country. So that was President Thomas Jefferson was the first person to have that position. The Department of the Treasury deals with the financial issues of a country. So that's Alexander Hamilton. And then I believe William Knox, if I'm not mistaken, but General Knox is in charge of the Army, right? The first Attorney General, the nation's top lawyer, is a man named Edmund Randolph, right? And so they're all part of the president's cabinet, right? This is a name that's a term we still use today, the cabinet, right? And it's the chief advisors of the experts of certain fields that are supposed to advise the president on how to act in certain ways. Almost immediately with the Constitution, you have the emergence of political factions, right? Which is kind of one thing that these great political minds like Jefferson and Madison recognized would happen, and Hamilton, right? And in the Federalist Papers, Hamilton and Madison argue that this system was designed to try to prevent one faction from taking over another, right? Whether it be a majority faction or a minority faction. So that's written in the Federalist Papers, kind of explaining why they set up the Constitution the way they did. Um, Washington was very, very leery of these political parties, these factions, and warned against them, um, especially in his farewell address that he gave when he was leaving office after his second term. But there's this tension between how things should happen, right? And the cabinet, his own advisors, since he tried to avoid factionalism, was divided between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, right? These are the first two political parties we have in our country's history: the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. All right, the Federalists wanted a strong central government, and they relied on that elastic clause that we looked at last lecture of the Constitution, right? The thing that said that the government has the power, federal government has the power to make laws as needed to fulfill their powers, right? And so it kind of helps them expand their power, the federal government, if wanted. The Democratic Republicans, not to be confused with the Democrats or the Republicans of today, right? This was a different party. They had strict interpretations of the Constitution, right? They would be what we call originalist, and they emphasized state rights and a decentralized national government, right? So the Federalists were led by Alexander Hamilton, and the Democratic Republicans were led by Thomas Jefferson, right? And one of the first conflicts that arose from this faction, right, the Federalists under Hamilton and the Democratic Republicans under Jefferson, was how to deal with the debt of the states, right? So after the Revolutionary War, each of the states borrowed money, right, to be able to finance the war, and they had all this debt, right? And some of them really weren't able to pay back as effectively as others, right? And so Hamilton believed the federal government should take responsibility of all these states' debts since we're now one unified nation. He also advocated creating a Bank of the United States, which would be semi-private and public. The government would put money into it, and so would private wealthy investors. But Jefferson and Madison believed that this bank and this plan would be creating a dangerous alliance between the government and wealthy business owners and hurting the ordinary person, right, which they fought for to begin with. And they also believed there was no constitutional precedent or constitutional authority for the federal government to create a national bank like this. And so this was a debate. It was very strongly opposed by Jefferson and Madison and other members of the Democratic Republicans. But it was a necessary step to take in order to kind of get the country on right fiscal footing, right financial footing. And so they made a compromise, right? We talked about, again, that compromise is constantly happening in a democratic system like ours. And one of the first challenges of trying to make themselves financially stable, right, they addressed through this compromise, right? So Jefferson and Madison agreed to back off in their opposition for Hamilton's plan to let it kind of go through Congress. But in return, they agreed that they would build a new capital. So they're going to move the capital out of New York City and move it to a new city they're going to build somewhere in the South, right, to kind of appease the Southern sectional interests, right, this idea of sectionalism, the different groups of people based on region kind of feeling a certain way, right? The Southerners wanted some kind of power, and they wanted capital closer to them because they felt they'd be able to influence more things if it was closer to them. And so this is how the District of Columbia is built. Eventually, that's named Washington, D.C., right, after George Washington. And it's a territory. So they actually, states of Maryland and Virginia agreed to cede territory to the federal government, to give up territory to the federal government to build this city. So it doesn't belong to any state. It doesn't have representatives in the Houses of Congress, right? But it is a territory instead. Right, so a quick showing here of the differences between Hamilton and Jefferson, essentially between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, right? So Hamilton concentrating power in the federal government, so a strong federal government. His greatest fear was mob rule, right? The people kind of just taking the mentality of a mob taking over and ruling things irrationally. Whereas Jefferson believed in the sharing power more with state and local governments, limiting the national government, and he feared absolute power. So these are two extremes, right? Hamilton and the Federalists feared chaos through mob rule, and Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans feared tyranny through a dictatorship because of too much power centralized in one level of the government. Right? And this idea of a loose versus strict interpretation of the Constitution is really interesting because it's still a debate we have today, right? If you guys pay attention to the Supreme Court nomination process happening right now with Amy Coney Barrett, this idea of originalism or strictly interpreting the Constitution is really up for debate, and the Democratic Party today criticizes this and fears that it could kind of undo some of their policies, right? And so this debate is still happening today. Right. So one of the earliest challenges faced by the federal government comes through the Whiskey Rebellion. Right. And this starts because Hamilton, the Secretary of Treasury, gets Congress to pass a protective tariff. Right. And a tariff is a tax on imported goods. Right. So in order to encourage American manufacturing and American goods, they tax goods coming into the country. Right. It was very successful, created a lot of money for the country, which was good. But Hamilton wanted to go one step further to further increase the wealth to help pay off that debt, right, to help keep the country stable. And so they got passed this excise tax, right? And this is a tax that's on a product's manufacture or sale, right? So if I was to produce clothing, right, in America, they would tax me on my product that I'm making and selling. So it taxed domestic goods, not just imported goods. So Hamilton gets this pushed through Congress, and he pushes through an excise tax on whiskey, the manufacture and sale of whiskey, which is one of the few ways that these poor frontier farmers, those kind of in the newer territories out west in the western parts of Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia, that's how they were able to make a living, right? Not just through farming, but through producing this whiskey. And so the soldiers got up in arms, and they were armed and ready to fight. And so to respond to this challenge, the federal government sent in soldiers, right, to demonstrate the authority and power they had, right? So one of these first challenges of insurrection is put down very quickly and very easily by the federal government. So a successful response to the challenge it faced. There's also a lot of foreign affairs going on at this time, right? So in 1789, you have the French Revolution, which is kind of inspired by our own revolution here in the United States, but it gets a little more radical. Like they kind of go for more of the mob rule and then these different separations of power. And so you have, during this French Revolution, you have what's called the Great Terror, right? Which is when people are being the radical wing of these rebels start killing even moderate members of their own party, right? So it becomes very chaotic. And they also, this terror era French government declares war on Britain, right? So now Britain and France are at war. And the Federalists wanted to support Britain, right? They believed what was going on in France was too radical, too extreme. The Democratic Republicans sided more with the French, right? Because the French had helped them during the American Revolution, and they believed they kind of owed them that. And so these different factions within Washington's cabinet are bickering about it, right? And Washington decides to proclaim and announce America will remain neutral. They're not going to help either side, right? So this neutrality is also a common theme throughout United States history, right? Since we're lucky enough to be removed from most of the rest of the world, right? We're isolated on our own continent. We're kind of able to stay neutral in a lot of things that other people aren't. And there's always tension if we should get involved or we should not get involved. We have this debate today, right? The debate of should the United States be so involved in all the affairs going on in the Middle East, or should we pull out, right? So this is still a debate that we have today. During this time, there's also tension with Spain, right? Because while we are isolated, we are still at this time bordering colonies of Spain and France and Britain, right? And so there is some diplomacy needed, right? And so this challenge of kind of Spain and Spanish were not letting the Americans use the Mississippi River or trade in New Orleans. And a man named Charles Pinckney creates a treaty with Spain in 1785 and successfully gets Spain to agree to an appropriate border with Florida. Spain gets rid of any land they believed they controlled east of the Mississippi. They also gave Americans trading rights on the Mississippi River and in New Orleans, right? So a very successful response to the challenge of the Spanish border. Right, another major challenge during this time is conflict with Native American groups. So you can see here in this map, you have the states of, the original states here. We also have now at this point some new states, right? Like Kentucky by this point is a state. This land here, right, is all part of what we call the Northwest Territory, right? The Northwest Ordinance kind of helps create states. But before there's states, there's fighting with Native Americans happening, right? Tecumseh is one Native American tribal leader who is giving the Americans a particular run for their money, right? And the United States has to kind of deal with this, right? And to deal with this. On top of this all, you also have British forts in American territory, forts they never gave up after the war, right? And so it's a real source of tension that's going to come back to be problematic during the War of 1812, right? So even in our own state of New York, right, there was some forts that the British had not given up even a couple years after the war was officially over. Right, then we move on to President Adams, right? So George Washington sets an important precedent. He decides to not run for a third term. He wants to retire, and so from then until President FDR in the 1930s, no president runs for more than 2 terms, right? And then after FDR, he gets elected to a 4th term before dying. After that, a constitutional amendment's passed that limits the presidency to 2 terms only. So he kind of sets this precedent, but Adams takes over after him then. His vice president becomes president. Um, right? But at this time, before the Electoral College had been reformed, you placed votes, right, and for president, and the second place of the presidency becomes the vice president, right? And so in this case, you had a Federalist president and a Democratic vice president. That would be like, say, President Trump winning the election, but President Biden getting the second amount of votes would become Vice President Biden, right? Imagine those two trying to work together. And so the same idea here, right? These two, while they had worked together in the past, they were of different sides, different perspectives, and that makes things challenging. And it further increases the idea of sectionalism. So Adams is from Massachusetts, and New England was more Federalist, right? More strong central government. And Jefferson was of the South, from Virginia, and a lot of the Southerners voted for him and emphasized the idea of states' rights, particularly because of the institution of slavery. One of the first things that President Adams has to deal with is what's called the XYZ affair. So as we know, right, there's the French Revolution going on in France, right, and President Adams sends a delegation of Americans over to discuss the relationship and try to make new treaties with the French. They were supposed to meet with the French Minister of Foreign Affairs, but instead they meet with 3 lower officials that, in documents that Adams gives to Congress, are named X, Y, and Z, right? And they demanded a bribe from the Americans in order to see the person they were supposed to originally see. And so this causes uproar in America. They're outraged at the French politicians to do this, and it increases tensions with France. And by 1798, to kind of respond to growing French threats to the American economy and American trade, the United States creates the Department of Navy, so the next department in the federal government to be formed. And there's essentially an undeclared naval war between France and the United States for several years, right, fighting over French taking over American ships and vice versa. This conflict going on, even though it's not officially declared war. What President Adams is kind of most notorious for, and if you we'll look at some old cartoons, right? He was also depicted as a king, as a monarch, because he passed these acts known as the Alien Sedition Acts. So in 1798, those anti-Federalist feelings against Adams and others were very predominant among the foreign-born citizens, I should say, or critics of the president. Right, so a lot of immigrants coming who were foreign-born, like French immigrants, for example, were opposed to Adams. And so to kind of retaliate, Adams has passed, through Congress though, of course, the Alien Acts, which raises the residency requirement for citizenship from 5 to 14 years. It's a major jump, right? So that angers a lot of people. Many people see that kind of as an abuse of his power, but what's seen more as abuse of his power is the Sedition Act, which sets fines and prison sentences for anyone spreading false, scandalous, and malicious statements against the government. Right? So false is understandable possibly, but malicious, right, just saying something mean about the government shouldn't be enough to be imprisoned, right? And so this caused an uproar, so much so that Thomas Jefferson and James Madison encouraged the Kentucky and Virginia assemblies to pass what they called acts of nullification, or to nullify or void these laws, right? Saying that these laws are not, they weren't laws, these assemblies didn't pass laws, they passed resolutions saying that they believed that the Sedition Act was unconstitutional, and since it was unconstitutional, it would not have to be enforced in these states. Right? They nullified it, essentially. And this is a really tricky situation and leads to a lot of problems later on in American history. But this idea of the power between state versus federal government comes up again, right? Do states have the right to nullify federal legislation, right? Or is the Constitution and the federal government the supreme law of the land, right? So which way is it? Does the federal government get to nullify and void state rights, or is it the other way around? And this shows the growing sectionalism that happens in our country's history, and that will eventually lead to the Civil War when we talk about slavery in a couple of units.